Mary Torno, Keith Hardy, and Jane Michael Camp. I'm inviting our team to the stage, evaluating the speech of our speaker number two, Jackie Olson. Mary, take it away.
Good afternoon, fellow Toastmasters, our general evaluator, especially our speaker, Jackie, and our team members will be Keith Hardy and Barbara. A correction on the comments from the general evaluator. We are here to give Jackie her paycheck. Yes, we are here to give her feedback to make her the best speaker she can be, maybe in a future speech contest, maybe in a presentation at one of our conventions. We don't know. We're here to help her. I'm going to ask my team members to start out their presentation by telling the audience what they're going to give feedback regarding for her humorous project she was doing today. I'm going to begin the process by giving comments on her organization. Jackie, you invigorated us by giving a strong introduction to the Toastmaster to let us know it was not easy to find humor in this generation of a pandemic, all kinds of other situations, even a collapse of our economy. But most of all, you were willing to do some self-deprecation. You did this through the process of telling us some personal stories. I could just sit in the street and watch you struggle as you tried to become a young person going across the street with all this guidance you were getting that you didn't understand. When you talked about self-deprecation, you talked about how was I supposed to know? And how were you supposed to know? They didn't define the cars. Reminds us of how we do things when we're speaking to anybody. We forget to give the limitations and to give our clear definition. That's why we're probably all in Toastmasters, because we're learning better communication skills. You had excellent opening story about your own beginning in life of wondering how people were to understand things. When you went into the story about the sports, about the Yukon, which is another story, I probably won't remember what you meant by Yukon. I just remember Yukon up in Canada, and perhaps I need some more stories to go along to define what you meant by Yukon. Your third story that I was beginning to listen to was the fact of cooking. And I thought, oh, she's going to bring a recipe about her from her grandfather. Therefore, you had segments in your presentation. You had wonderful stories. And I'm not so sure they all tied together, because bridging in this case was probably a complication for you, just like it was complicated to live through a Zoom session of Toastmasters. I would suggest that each of you that are listening today, you send an email or a chat message helping our speaker, Jackie, to take these different stories and make them humorous and realize that she was truly self-deprecating herself, and at the same time helping us to understand how hard it is to understand what did you know or I didn't know. You have wonderful ability to tell stories. You have ability to gather some miscellaneous situations to humor us. And I appreciate your effort, your great effort to present your speech for us today and how you work through it. I will turn my presentation to our second presenter, Barbara.
Thank you, Mary, my fellow Toastmasters, and especially Jackie. There was a manual, Speaking on Television, and I think that would have been a perfect manual for the Zoom age. My area that I'm covering today are the sports analogies, language, audience reaction, vocal variety, and gestures, which really are a challenge in the Zoom environment. We don't get to see your full body. If we see your full body, you're too far away to see. And if we get to see you and you're close enough, we don't get to see everything that you're doing. You did a delightful job. You know, we scattered the seeds of humor throughout a speech. We scatter bits of information. We sow these seeds, hoping that by the end we cultivate the laugh, we cultivate the insight that we're trying to give people. You did that very well today. Back to the gestures. It's hard to speak on Zoom and make gestures. Everyone looks like a Subway sandwich artist. This is all we do. And I was thinking that one way that you might be able to provide gestures that make sense in the Zoom environment is things like with the North and South Pole. My daughter was saying she didn't want to go to the North Pole to see Santa. She wanted to go down to the South Pole where it's warm. You know, we have to adjust our gestures so that they make sense in that Zoom environment. This goes into vocal variety. Again, Zoom, we all have the same volume level, so we don't get louder and softer. We don't really get to have vocal variety, but I did enjoy your pauses. Part of that vocal variety is the pausing and pacing in the speech. And you did give us time to catch up on some of these great jokes that you were sowing throughout the speech. One improvement I would say in that is when you were talking about your husband with Yukon. I think that if you would have adopted a bit of just a masculine tone with Yukon this and Yukon that, so we know it's that manly voice that's telling you about Yukon, even if it is the wrong Yukon. And your speech did hold a lot of truth there. My husband, who watches sports, but not basketball, he was 70 years old when he finally figured out why Connecticut, because he always called him Connecticut, why Connecticut's mascot was the Husky, because it's Yukon Huskies. It is very true that, how could I not know that? I loved your speech. I loved the expressions and the analogies that you made. I love that parked cars don't count. When I was a little one, I could never figure out why, if drugs were illegal, the police didn't arrest everyone in drugstores. And I wouldn't go into a drugstore. How could I not know that? It's true. Your speech is honest. It's real. And you did cultivate the laughs and the pearls of wisdom. Madam Team Evaluator.
Keith, are you there?
I'm here. You, excuse me, sorry. Thank you, Madam Team Leader, Mr. General Evaluator, fellow members, our guest expert, and Jackie, who now knows so much more. I'm focused on how Jackie prepared and adjusted her speech in terms of audience awareness. And she asked the three of us in particular to make sure her references in her speech would be understood by someone who is not native to the United States and perhaps not native to Minnesota, and that her sports references would be relatable to people who don't follow college sports. So I'm going to share feedback in those areas. So Jackie, first, as a consumer, I loved your speech. You know, I understood, I got it. You know, you don't count parked cars. That was classic. That's a classic line, and that's something a 4-year-old would say to our 6-year-old. So that was a great line. You know, the whole piece related to Ed, from the sports side to the cooking side. So yeah, I totally enjoyed your speech as a consumer. Now, mixing in some comments as that producer as well as consumer of this speech, working on humor, cultivating humor for different audience members. What I especially enjoyed is that you spoke from a perspective that I feel anyone could relate to, whether they knew sports, college sports or not, whether they were born or grew up here in Minnesota and United States or not, and that's from your perspective. So as was mentioned by Barbara, the self-deprecating humor, that's always a good way to go about sharing humor with a mixed audience. Now, specifically with the parked cars, you start out by saying you grew up in Shakopee. So people who are not native to the Twin Cities wouldn't know where that is geographically. Maybe just a quick phrase, Shakopee City, southwest of Minneapolis or something like that. So that's a quick directional so people know where that fits on the map. Otherwise, I felt people could relate to streets. Well, you could ask as a rhetorical question, hey, do you remember trying to figure out when to cross the street? And people could relate that to wherever they grew up. So that's something to consider. With the sports, we got the UConn and the UConn with a Y, UConn with a U. So that part I thought you explained well. You mentioned March Madness. So people who don't follow college sports wouldn't necessarily know that phrase in terms of sports. You might just want to make a quick phrase explaining what that is. But what I really thought was just how I switched my mindset to this sports reference that people can relate to, especially if they don't follow sports. I thought you related well to the audience from that perspective. And finally, just some of the other phrases that you use, I felt eventually you explained them well enough for people who weren't native to this area to understand. In transitioning, you might want to just give a point. So then later in life, when I got married, my husband was a sports person, just adding a phrase to transition as you get ready for your next comments and next story. Great speech overall. I look forward to you sharing more. Madam Team Leader.
Thank you, team members. Now we will ask Jackie for 1 minute of her response to their feedback she received. Welcome, Jackie.
I also need a bigger unmute button. Thank you, team. That's really helpful. And I learned today that you never want to follow Rochelle Schmitz in a speech. So my mistake. My inability to get online this morning was not the first thing that riled me today. So I felt like I was coming in just a little screwy, but I much appreciate it. I love the North Pole, South Pole that does give me, because I really struggle to find gestures that are meaningful in such a small space. So I much appreciate that. All the little things, the vocalizing my husband, that's a great idea. I don't know why I didn't think that. I like the idea of the rhetorical question. And definitely the organization was probably a little worse because I forgot 2 paragraphs entirely, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for going over all those antagonistic episodes this morning and being a speaker at Saturday Morning Live and being willing to receive the feedback. We now have, I believe, 1.5 minutes to get response from the audience, please.
I'll jump
Anybody?
in. This is Pat. Jackie, I just wanted to let you know how I laughed out loud a number of times in your speech. Well done.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have another comment, please? Thank you for the feedback, Pat. We need to hear about laughter.
I was going to point out, I don't think I put this in my email to you, Jackie, but I appreciate how you looked at different audience. You gave the audience that, you know, understands some of the gaps growing up and some of the goofy things that you think and don't realize till you're older. You gave the sports analogy to bring the sports people in, and then you also brought the cooking analogy that brought a totally different audience in. So I just appreciate the fact that you had different stories that would attract different people to your speech.
Thank you. I believe our time is up, but I want to thank all of you for listening. And
We have one more minute. I'm sorry. I didn't take the red
okay,
off.
well, I saw the red.
Sorry.
We have time for another comment at least then, please. Practice your
Jackie.
feedback.
Jackie, I like the way that you got us all thinking about the ways that we all have mysterious gaps in our knowledge, which is a line you said. I think we all have that. A few years ago, a new show came out and I was really excited. It was called Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And it turns out it was not that at all. It was Keeping Up with the Kardashians. So I thought that it was a nerd Star Trek show, but it wasn't. So happens to all of us.
Thank you. Just as she was sharing her stories, probably is what we're all experiencing just to get through a Zoom Toastmaster meeting. Appreciate your comments. Again, I encourage you to send email to Jackie so she can go ahead and present this speech at another club and take all our feedback and put it to good use. Back to our general evaluator.
Thank you.